Hagen, Hagen. I have been at the University of Michigan for, I think, 48 years at this point. For the last 2 years, I'm emeritus professor. I'm still involved in many things, both on campus, locally, and nationally. And my general field is developmental psychology, which covers from birth to adulthood and even beyond. Within that, I've worked in several different areas, including preschool, young children, adolescents, and currently my special focus is on the field that we now call emerging adulthood, which has to do with what's going on developmentally and what are the transitions people go through from roughly 18 to the mid-20s or so. And for a variety of reasons, that has become a special field of focus recently because young people seem to be extending their adolescence and not taking on adult responsibilities the way they did maybe 40, 50 years ago. And it's not just a phenomenon in the United States. It's happening in most developed countries, in Europe and in the Asian countries that are well developed, are seeing the same thing. So for example, if you interview people in the college age and ask them what are the 5 or 6 most important things for you in the next 5 years, it used to be they'd say, well, graduating, making money, getting married, having children. Now those don't even come up anymore. More self-identity kind of things come up. Certain things about anxiety, about where am I going and how long am I going to be living in my parents' basement. Those are the things that seem to come up. Some very practical, some much more having to do with acquiring self-identity. But anyhow, that's one of the areas that my current work is focusing on. Within that, my interests have always had to do with learning and what I call effective learning. And in more recent years, it's become much more fashionable to include diversity, which I did long before that word came into use. But back then, we in psychology talked about individual differences or variations across and among people. And so now the work we do, again, I'm still doing work with very young children through the National Head Start work, for example, which has to do with children from the cradle to grades 1 or 2. And then I have been working and developing my own approach and instruments to work with college students. We've had tremendous gain in knowledge, in research, and understanding the whole learning process. And we can look at many different things that have happened, I would say going back to the 70s and 80s, but much more recently, the last 20 years or so. For example, the National Academy of Sciences has focused a lot on learning and effective learning, and have produced a couple of task force that have produced volumes about what learning is. There's a whole new field now called the learning sciences that's multidisciplinary. My field, psychology, developmental psychology, educational psychology, contributes a lot to that. But other areas are doing a lot of that work as well, including things from biology, neuroscience, and microbiology.
Microbiology. I was a microbiologist as an undergrad. So.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because there's a fascinating book, and unfortunately I don't have it with me, but John Medina wrote the book Brain Rules, and I've been using it in classes now for the last few years, and he's actually trained as a microbiologist at University of Washington, Seattle. And the book is organized into 12 chapters that have to do with how the brain works, how the brain affects us, and this relates directly to some of your questions right here. Because he begins, using sort of an evolutionary approach and how the human brain sort of got to where it is today. And then he talks about how the brain is an information processor and all aspects of our being are a function of the brain. Most people think of the brain as the place learning takes place, but we know now that emotions take place in the brain just as much. And the bringing together or the saddling of emotions to work with cognitive processing is what allows us to function well and produce things in based on different kinds of tasks that we're given or tasks we decide to focus on. And the general model, and I'm sure you are well aware of this, talks about that first we have to get information into the system. So attention is very important. And then within attention we talk about selective attention. And then it goes into some sort of memory. And we have to have things in it's called working memory now, or short-term memory. And then we do various things to that depending on various kinds of input. And we can then produce all different kinds of things, again, either based on tasks we're given from the outside world, which happens an awful lot, or from our own interest, our own internal drives and motivations and so forth.
All right. So attention is a huge aspect of it. So it would seem is being able to focus on
exactly. And the big issue now, again, I'm sure you're very aware of, is whether or not we can multitask.
Yes.
And one of my colleagues, whose name I was going to mention to you at some point, David Meyer, is very famous, has been on national and international media arguing that we can't really multitask, or when we try to, we do things very poorly. And so that would indicate that, even the best and brightest amongst us are greatly handicapped when we try, or when we think we can attend to and process two or more things at a time. And obviously the area of distracted driving is a huge area, but there are many other arenas that we're all working in as well right now.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So then, if we were to try to decide, characterize the sort of context in which the brain learns best, what would you suggest as sort of the optimal conditions for that?
As with any kind of human functioning, we want to be in a situation that has the appropriate amount of stress. A little bit of stress doesn't hurt, but you don't want to have too much stress. You want to have the individual learner to not be overly tired and so forth. In fact, in his book, Medina spells out many of these things. This is a summary that I put together for one of my classes that I just printed out. And one of the big points he makes is the 10-minute rule. Have you heard of that? It's basically saying that most of us can't really focus attention more than 10 or 12 minutes. And so many people are now saying, not just Medina, that our whole teaching learning model that we use is a very flawed model, because it usually has people have to spend at least 50 minutes in a learning situation, and sometimes 2 hours or more. And in fact, some of my research has looked at what happens in a learning environment and had coders in the room, and then we code student attention, and you find exactly it comes up for the first 10 or 15 minutes, then it drops off dramatically. Then if you introduce some new things, you can get it to go back up again. But usually the individual lecturer isn't very good at that. You have to introduce new kind of things into the learning process. You get the students to work on small group projects, or I'm sure you can imagine. We used huddle boards, for example, a lot, where students are sitting at tables and we have a board up there, and there's a huge amount of work going on that right now to try to show that thing. So anyhow, the 10-minute rule and the use of hooks are that's what I call some of these things, and a lack of, or that we shouldn't try to expect students to multitask, because that's not going to work very well. And then things like stress, diet, and sleep. And he has chapters in the book that deal with that too. And again, there's a real literature on each of those. And usually we argue on most psychological functions now that there's sort of a min-max to it, and like too little is not good and too much is not good, and there's sort of something in the middle. And the way you have to in some way gather some sort of data on your students or on your workers or whatever. A lot of my interest right now also is bridging the gap between students and people in the work environment, because I would argue that 90% of what we're finding helps to make learning better and more efficient will also affect performance in most learning and work environments.
So when you're talking about sort of breaking things up and separate and not getting bogged down in like the sort of lecturing format and working in groups. So when you're studying, how do you manage that in the studying situation? Like, say I have a huge volume of material that I need to know for a psychology
Right, that was
exam.
one of the things you listed here, and so of course we'll as you well know, we'll always tell people don't put it off till the night before. But let's say you do, or you're forced into some massed practice. There are some things that can do. A friend of mine is Robert Bjork, who's at UCLA. And again, he's very, very well known, and he's done some of the seminal research on learning in college and learning in the college environment, but it applies to other environments as well. And one of the bottom lines that he's concluded is that students don't really know how they learn, and a lot of the things they do are working against them. And so, for example,
I would believe that.
well, getting back to this question of having to cram for an exam, one of the findings that's very, very robust is that given you have the same amount of time, if you space it out, you will learn and retain much more later than if you do mass practice. Now, for the poor student who has only the 8 hours and has to stay up all night, you can still apply these principles there. And one of the things I've worked in the area, I should mention, of learning disabilities, and more recently attention deficit disorder as well. In fact, I went back to school at UCLA for a year in 1978 or 9 to learn about learning disabilities, because UCLA was the place that was pioneering, and it was learning disabilities as a construct wasn't invented till the mid-1960s, and then it's an invented construct in many people's minds, and so is attention deficit disorder, but that's another story. But the point there is that one of the things we've spent, one of the good things from the special education movement in this country is that we've focused especially on those kids who don't learn so well. And we've learned all kinds of things to help them learn better. But 90% of what we've learned will help all students learn better. And in fact, I was at a faculty dinner a few years ago with some very eminent people, and we got to talking about this. And all of these people who were, had their PhDs for 20, 30 years were saying how one of the things they hated most is to have to go and sit in a lecture for an hour, and that they felt that their attention span was like 15, 20 minutes, and then they were off to thinking about whether they had to pick up kids or do something else and so forth. So many of these things are not unique to certain situations, and if we're talking about, the student, whether he's gone past the point of being able to space things out really well, you still, if you take breaks, you work out a plan ahead of time. And I always say that the last thing to do to read a book or to read a chapter is to sit down and read it from beginning to end. You have to much more actively involve yourself, and Bill McKeechee probably made that same point. Some of his research was pioneering in that kind of area. So what I typically do if I'm reading a new chapter I know little or nothing about is I'll read the first few pages, I'll read the last few, and then I'll sort of see how it's organized, and I might take a piece of paper or something and map out what I think are the main things and then start filling in.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really good idea. It's interesting too because I've been in that situation where I'm like, okay, I have to read this chapter, and then I do, and I'm like, I have no idea what I just read.
Right, and many people will say the second worst thing to do is to take a yellow marker and just mark it as you're going along, because most people tend to mark much too much.
Yeah.
And so and I mean, I still sometimes do it, or I'll make little notes in the margins or so forth, and then go back. But you're much better off to take out a piece of paper or hop on your computer screen and start making your own sense out of it.
Right.
Because the sooner you do that, the more actively involved you are, and then certain kind of hookups occur.
Interesting. And this is something definitely that Mikishi brought up, which was the idea of having to create a sort of narrative that is meaningful to you, to connect the information
right.
to something that you will care about. And
Exactly.
It's just floating out there.
And that gets back to this whole thing of motivation and emotion, where back when I was first in psychology, you either studied learning and cognition, or you studied motivation and affect and social things. Now we realize they're all part of the same world, and you just can't treat them separately anymore. Even though some schools still divide their courses up that way, we've been trying to move more and more to having courses that are integrated across different topics like that.
It's, I think, in any biological system, it's certainly the human brain is a biological system.
Yes.
You have these, everything's interacting in ways, and to separate out the systems, it's not always, it gives you an idea, but not the full picture.
Well, I mean, in some ways you have to study the component parts, but then you immediately have to see how do they function, with each other as well. I think time is the most important metric that we have, and most people let time be a negative or it works against them. And one of the things we need to do is understand the role of time better in learning or however we're functioning, and then make it work for us. For example, are you familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's books?
Yes.
Okay, well, this is his book called The 10,000 Hour Rule, and I won't go into any detail. It's from Outliers, but it's a fascinating notion that I think we still need to understand better. But he's arguing that to become really, really good at almost anything, whether it's to become a virtuoso violinist or a chemist or whatever, that you have to put in a huge number of hours, and there's nothing magical about the 10,000, but it's something like that it's going to take to become really good or proficient. But obviously then it's going to be spaced out over years, because you can't mass in 10,000 hours in a semester or some such thing. Along with that, there's another rule that I find fascinating, which is the 80-20 rule. Are you familiar with that? It was devised originally by an Italian economist named Pareto, but it's been used in many ways. I think we have, pull out that book, the 80-20 principle right there. There's several books now on it. When I used to do some teaching with very different kinds of students, just as a interest of mine, not U of M students and so forth, but they were people whose lives really didn't have much time. They were parents and they were working and so forth. And some of the notions, if you can start to apply them, but basically what the 80-20 principle says about time is that most of us, most of the time, achieve 80% of what we do in 20% of our time. And that applies to students, and it's actually been well documented by people in organizational and industrial psychology, in workplaces and so forth. So if you think about it, a person works a 40-hour week, and most people accomplish most of what they do that week in one day. Now it might be spread out over the 5 days of the week. I've given students assignments giving them the principles of this, and then to go out and try to apply it to some part of your life. And to the student, they will come back and say, there's some truth to this. It may not be, it's not that it's exactly 80-20.
Right.
In some cases it might be 90-10, in others it might be 70-30, but the point is that most of us do not use our time that efficiently, and we find ways to fill up our time no matter what. And if we're forced into looking at that, we might be able to accomplish more with less. Or it also applies to what we were talking about earlier with Bob Bjork's research with college students and mass versus space practice and so forth.
Right. So for students that are really not following any of this because they're out there and they're probably the majority that do things like stay up all night. Do we know anything about the long-term effects of that, or the effects of like that on learning? Do we know how?
Well, yeah, I think we know a lot, and it sort of depends on how you frame the question.
Okay.
As I was saying earlier, we know that you need to be motivated to be learning, and in many situations and in many contexts, you might or may not want to say a certain amount of anxiety or even a small amount of stress may be helpful, because that sort of keeps you going.
Right.
And if you know you have that exam coming up in 10 days from now, or you have a 15-page paper due next week or so forth, that sort of provides some of that for you. To me, the important thing, and that we have a lot of research on now, shows how much of that is there, and is it affecting you in a positive way or a negative way. And there's a lot of literature now on what's called toxic stress. And that's, it's not toxins in the environment, it's more psychological toxins that are leading you to feel like you're under the gun all the time. And I've worked a lot with student athletes, and I've also worked with students with learning disabilities a lot. And those two groups both feel that a lot more than I think other students do, because their time is more constrained, or students with learning disabilities have to spend more time to get to the same goal and so forth. So I think it sort of becomes a vicious cycle, because they're building that up, and then that in turn makes them learn even less efficiently. And so we want to try to come up with ways to organize this, to customize it or tailor it so people can see how they can plug it into their own life situation, lifestyle, and so forth. And again, I was referring earlier to the difference between regular education, special education. And it's kind of an irony that special education has found out much better ways to teach and learn than regular education has, and now we're discovering we can take a lot of those things and apply it in a regular education setting. Unfortunately, almost none of that's been done at the college level. Where it's been done is at the grade school or junior high or even high school level. But college professors, you try to tell them this stuff, most of them are going to say, I've heard people say, as I'm sure you have, my goal is to get a curve.
Yes, especially with biological science.
Yes, right. Literally, they'll say that, that's our main goal, is to get a curve. And so that's, so how do you convince them that trying to get everyone up to some learning level is really important if that's not what they see as their goal?
And that gets into a whole discussion about the motivation of people who teach at the college level.
Which ranges are all across the way. I think in our department we're really fortunate because of the nature of what we do.
Yeah.
We have a huge number of people that are really, truly, committed to the learning process. But in many departments and many branches of higher education, that's not what they're focused, and that's not what they're rewarded for.
Right. One interesting question that I think a lot of people have is, what about the effect of music?
Again, there's a fair amount of research. I don't know whether Bill McKeechee mentioned it or not. A couple of his students did a really good book on learning that I have right there. It's the Learning to Learn book. And they will argue, and many other people will argue, that in spite of what we believe or think, there's really no evidence that music helps. And if it's music with voices or singing, it definitely hurts. If it's just music, it may, in some cases, not have a negative effect, or it'll have a very small negative effect. But I would argue, on the other hand, some people could figure out ways to incorporate music into their study times to help make the whole thing more pleasurable, and decide when they're going to do it. And I don't think we've tested it that way. The ways that have been tested have been sort of very straightforward, giving sort of short-term learning tasks to people in the presence of different kind of distractors, some of which are music. So I'm uncomfortable in saying music isn't good, but most of the research shows it's not.
And one thing that Dr. Chauncey mentioned was the idea that, you know, maybe if the music is at a low level and it's just sort of like a white noise or something that provides, you know, it improves the context in which you're trying to learn.
Well, that's where I would argue that the individual can probably figure out ways where, and to really show that it's improving your learning, I think, is very difficult, because you have to think about what would that really be. Again, as I said, most of the studies that have been done have been in rather artificial constrained situations where you do something for X amount of time, then you're given a test on it, and they consistently find that the presence of anything is not good.
Music.
But I think, you know, if you're thinking of yourself spending 3 or 4 hours studying in the evening, you could certainly incorporate music as part of that routine in the way. But I would argue that you probably want, when you're doing certain tasks, to have the music off. You know, and if you have control over when it's on and off, then that'd be fascinating research.